When Dr. Martinez handed me that manila folder and said, 6 months, maybe 8 if we're lucky, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in that sterile room with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and thought about my ex-husband Derek's American Express black card. The one he'd been bragging about at our daughter's graduation, just 3 months earlier. The one that was still linked to my old email address from when we were married. The one he had no idea I could still access. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You see, while Derek was busy telling everyone how his crazy ex-wife was finally getting what she deserved, and while my so-called friends were whispering about karma and bad choices, I was calculating exactly how much financial chaos I could create in 180 days. Because, if I was going down, I wasn't going alone. My name is Inez Walker, and 3 days ago I was a 54-year-old marketing director at a mid-sized pharmaceutical company in Portland, Oregon. I had a corner office, a decent 401k, and a reputation for being the woman who could salvage any campaign disaster. People respected me, or at least they pretended to. I thought I had everything figured out. Then came the headache, not the kind you get from staring at spreadsheets too long or dealing with incompetent clients. These were different. Sharp, persistent, like someone was driving an ice pick through my skull at random intervals. I ignored them for weeks, popping ibuprofen like candy and telling myself it was just stress from the Morrison account. The first time I collapsed was during a client presentation. One moment I was explaining our Q4 strategy for their new arthritis medication, and the next I was on the floor of their conference room with 12 suits staring down at me like I'd just committed professional suicide. My assistant Jamie drove me to the emergency room, where they ran test after test, each one more invasive than the last. Dr. Martinez was young, probably younger than my daughter Sophie, with kind eyes and the sort of gentle manner that immediately told me the news wasn't going to be good. She sat across from me in her tiny office, surrounded by medical journals and a wilting plant that someone had forgotten to water, and explained that the MRI had revealed a tumor. Glioblastoma, she called it. Stage 4. Inoperable. 6 months, she said again, and I watched her mouth move but couldn't quite process the words. We can try chemotherapy, radiation, but honestly, Mrs. Walker, at this stage we're talking about quality of life, not quantity. I left the hospital in a daze, driving home through Portland's afternoon traffic like I was moving through water. Everything seemed slower, quieter, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my Honda Accord for 20 minutes, staring at the house I'd bought after the divorce. It was small, tidy, painted a cheerful yellow that I'd chosen specifically because Derek hated bright color. He'd called it aggressively optimistic during one of our custody exchanges. Like even my choice in paint was a personal attack on his sensibilities. That night, I called Sophie first. She was 26, living in Seattle with her boyfriend Marcus, working as a graphic designer for some tech startup that I didn't pretend to understand. She cried when I told her, which surprised me. We hadn't been close since the divorce. She'd taken Derek's side early on, believing his version of events, accepting his narrative that I was the unstable one, the one who'd destroyed our perfect family with my erratic behavior and unreasonable demands. Mom, I'm so sorry, she sobbed into the phone. I'll drive down this weekend. We need to talk about treatment options, about getting a second opinion. I told her I'd think about it, but I already knew there wouldn't be a second opinion. I'd done enough research after leaving Dr. Martinez's office to understand what glioblastoma meant. 6 months was optimistic. Most people got 4. I didn't call Derek. Let him find out from Sophie, or from someone else, or never. I honestly didn't care. Instead, I opened my laptop and began what would become my new full-time job. I started with the easy stuff, the accounts I could remember from our marriage. Derek was meticulous about his credit, obsessive even. He checked his credit score weekly, monitored every transaction, prided himself on having what he called platinum-level financial discipline, which made it all the more satisfying when I discovered he'd never bothered to remove me as an authorized user on half his accounts. The American Express was just the beginning. There was also the Chase Sapphire, the Citibank Platinum, even a stupid store card for some high-end men's clothing boutique that charged $800 for a shirt. All of them still linked to email addresses he'd forgotten about, still sending statements to old phone numbers that forwarded to my current cell. I didn't start canceling them immediately. That would have been too obvious, too traceable. Instead, I began documenting everything. Account numbers, customer service phone numbers, security questions I might need to answer. I created a spreadsheet, color-coded and organized by priority: green, for the accounts I could cancel immediately; yellow for the ones that might require more finesse; red for the ones that would need careful timing. Derek had always underestimated me. During our marriage, he'd handled all the finances, treated me like I was too scattered and emotional to understand money. He'd dole out my allowance from our joint account like I was a teenager asking for gas money, always with some lecture about fiscal responsibility and long-term planning. Even after the divorce, even after I'd proven I could manage perfectly well on my own, he'd made snide comments about my financial literacy during Sophie's events. He was about to get a very expensive education in exactly how financially literate I could be. The first week after my diagnosis, I threw myself into research with the same intensity I'd once reserved for product launches. I learned about credit reporting agencies, about the specific language required to cancel authorized user privileges, about the difference between closing an account and simply removing access. I studied Derek's spending patterns, noting when he typically made large purchases, when he traveled for work, when he'd be most likely to notice irregularities. I also started making lists, not just of his financial accounts but of everyone who'd hurt me over the years, every colleague who'd smiled to my face while undermining my projects, every friend who'd sided with Derek during the divorce without bothering to hear my side, every family member who'd treated me like damaged goods after the papers were signed. My sister Linda was near the top of that list. She'd been Derek's biggest supporter during our split, constantly talking about what a good man he was and how I needed to look at my own behavior if I wanted to save my marriage. She'd conveniently forgotten about the night I'd called her crying because Derek had screamed at me for an hour about leaving dishes in the sink, or the time I'd shown up at her house with a bruised wrist after he'd grabbed me during an argument about Sophie's college tuition. Linda ran a small catering business, the kind of operation that lived and died by word-of-mouth recommendations and online reviews. She was proud of her 5-star Yelp rating, constantly posting screenshots on Facebook like she'd won some sort of humanitarian award. I wondered how long it would take for that rating to drop if the right kind of reviews started appearing, but that was thinking too small, too petty. I had 6 months and a lifetime of grudges to settle. I needed to think big. The breakthrough came during my second week of research when I stumbled across Derek's LinkedIn profile. He'd updated it recently, adding a new position as regional sales director at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, my old company's biggest competitor. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek was now working in the same industry where I'd spent the last 15 years building my reputation. More importantly, his new position meant he was likely managing corporate accounts, handling client entertainment, maybe even traveling on the company dime. All activities that would require significant credit card usage, the kind of usage that would be immediately noticed if those cards suddenly stopped working. I started with the American Express on a Tuesday morning. I called the customer service line, navigated through the automated system, and was connected to a pleasant representative named Carlos, who seemed genuinely sorry to hear that I wanted to remove myself as an authorized user. "Is there a particular reason you're making this change today, Ms. Walker?" he asked. "Divorce," I said simply. "Just cleaning up loose ends." Carlos was efficient and sympathetic, removing my access within minutes, and confirming that Derek would receive notification of the change within 2 business days. I thanked him and hung up, then immediately called the number back. This time I got a representative named Michelle. I explained that I needed to update the contact information on my ex-husband's account. I was Derek Walker now, calling to change the email and phone number on file because I'd recently moved and my ex-wife had been vindictive about forwarding my mail. Michelle was less chatty than Carlos, but just as helpful. Within 10 minutes, Derek's account notifications were being sent to an email address I'd created specifically for this purpose, and his customer service calls would be routed through a Google Voice number that went straight to my phone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The genius of it was that Derek wouldn't know anything was wrong until he tried to use the card, and by then I'd be 3 steps ahead of him. I spent the rest of that week establishing the same pattern with his other account. Cancel my authorized user status, then call back and redirect his notifications to emails and phone numbers I controlled. It was tedious work requiring different voices, different backstories, but I'd spent years in marketing. I knew how to be convincing. The hardest part was the wait. I wanted to see the chaos unfold immediately, wanted to watch Derek scramble when his carefully constructed financial life started crumbling. But patience was crucial. If I moved too fast, if too many accounts were affected at once, it might trigger fraud alerts, or cause him to investigate more thoroughly. Instead, I used the time to expand my research. I dug deeper into Derek's current life, his new job, his social media presence. He was dating someone now, a woman named Victoria, who worked in HR at his company. She was younger than me, blonder, with the kind of aggressively cheerful Instagram presence that suggested she'd never had an original thought in her life. Victoria posted constantly about their relationship, tagging Derek in photos from expensive restaurants and weekend trips to wine country. She seemed particularly fond of documenting their shopping expeditions, posting pictures of designer handbags and jewelry with captions like "My man knows how to spoil me," and "feeling so blessed." It occurred to me that Derek's credit cards weren't just funding his lifestyle, they were funding hers too. Every dinner at Le Bernardin, every weekend in Napa, every overpriced bracelet from Tiffany was being charged to accounts that I could shut down with a simple phone call. The thought made me smile for the first time since my diagnosis. By the end of my 3rd week, I had control over Derek's financial communications and had begun the delicate process of creating what I privately called the schedule. Each account would be canceled on a specific day, timed to maximize inconvenience and minimize his ability to respond quickly. The American Express would go first, during his quarterly sales trip to Denver. The Chase Sapphire would follow 2 days later, right before his dinner with Victoria's parents. The Citibank Platinum would disappear the morning of Hartwell's annual company retreat, when he'd be trying to pay for hotel rooms and team dinners. But I wasn't just thinking about Derek anymore. My diagnosis had given me a strange sort of clarity, a freedom, that came from having nothing left to lose. I started researching my other targets, the people who'd written me off, or betrayed me over the years. My former boss at the pharmaceutical company, Robert Chen, had been particularly cruel during my final weeks there. Once my medical leave started and word got out about my diagnosis, he'd made it clear that my position would be restructured, and that I shouldn't expect to return. He'd done it all very legally, very carefully, but the message was unmistakable. Sick employees were liabilities and liabilities got cut. Robert was also, I discovered, terrible at digital security. His LinkedIn profile was public, his Facebook privacy settings were a joke, and he'd apparently never heard of 2-factor authentication. It took me less than an hour to find his home address, his wife's maiden name, and the name of the street he'd grown up on. All information that might come in handy if I needed to access accounts or reset passwords. My sister Linda was even easier. She'd given me the login information to her business accounts years ago when she'd asked me to help with her website. She'd never bothered to change the passwords, probably never even thought about it. I could access her scheduling system, her customer database, even her online banking if I wanted to. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time since Martinez had delivered my death sentence, I felt something resembling hope. Not hope for a cure or a miracle, I'd accepted that part of my fate, but hope that I could spend my remaining months doing something meaningful, something that would matter. I was going to make every single person who'd wronged me remember exactly who Inez Walker was. The 4th week brought my first test run. Derek was scheduled to attend a client dinner in Portland, one of those expensive affairs where pharmaceutical executives spent thousands of dollars on wine and Wagyu beef, while pretending to discuss market strategies. Victoria had posted about it on Instagram, showing off a new dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. I waited until 30 minutes before their reservation to cancel the American Express. The process was simple now that I had control of Derek's account notification. I called customer service, explained that Derek Walker was concerned about fraudulent charges and wanted to close the account immediately. The representative was understanding and efficient, closing the account within minutes and confirming that a new card would not be issued. Then I sat back and waited. The first sign of trouble came 45 minutes later, when Victoria posted a confused Instagram story about their reservation being temporarily delayed. 30 minutes after that, Derek called the customer service number, which now forwarded directly to my Google Voice line. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Thank you for calling American Express customer service. This is Jennifer. How can I help you today?" Derek's voice was tight with barely controlled frustration. "Yes, I'm trying to figure out why my card was declined at dinner tonight. The account is current. There shouldn't be any issues." I put on my most sympathetic customer service voice. "I'm so sorry to hear about that, Mr. Walker. Let me look into your account right away. Can you please verify the last 4 digits of your social security number?" Derek rattled off the numbers, the same ones I'd memorized during 22 years of marriage. I made appropriate typing sounds, as if I was accessing his account. "I see the issue, Mr. Walker. It appears your account was closed earlier today due to security concerns. Were you planning to travel or make any unusual purchases?" "Closed?" Derek's voice shot up an octave. "I didn't close anything. This has to be a mistake. I understand your concerns, sir. Unfortunately, once an account is closed for security reasons, it can't be immediately reopened. You'll need to speak with our fraud department, but they're closed until Monday. I can transfer you to our after-hours line, but there will be a wait time of approximately 45 minutes. I could hear Victoria's voice in the background, asking what was wrong. Derek muffled the phone and had a heated whispered conversation before coming back on the line. "This is ridiculous. I've been a customer for 15 years. I need this resolved tonight. I completely understand, Miss Walker, and I wish I could do more to help. The fraud department takes these security measures very seriously. In the meantime, do you have another form of payment you could use this evening?" Derek hung up without answering. Victoria's Instagram remained suspiciously quiet for the rest of the evening. No photos of expensive dinners or romantic cocktails, just silence. I slept better that night than I had since my diagnosis. The next morning brought a flurry of activity on Derek's other account. He'd clearly spent the weekend trying to figure out what had happened with the American Express, calling the real customer service line and discovering that his account had indeed been closed. He'd also discovered that his contact information had been changed, though the representatives couldn't explain how or when that had happened. I monitored his efforts through the email notifications I was now receiving: password reset attempts, fraud alerts, customer service callback. Derek was working himself into a panic, and we hadn't even gotten to the good stuff yet. That week, I also began reaching out to my other targets. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be traced back to me, just small seeds of chaos that would grow into bigger problems over time. For Robert Chen, I started with his professional reputation. I created several fake LinkedIn profiles and began posting negative reviews of the pharmaceutical company's management practices on industry forums. Nothing libelous, just the kind of insider criticism that would make potential business partners think twice about working with them. For Linda, I took a more direct approach. Using my access to her catering business systems, I began making small changes to her scheduling software. Nothing major, just shifting appointments by 30 minutes here and there, changing delivery addresses slightly, modifying menu specifications in ways that would cause confusion but not immediate disaster. The beauty of these small sabotages was that they would compound over time. Derek would eventually figure out how to restore his credit cards, but not before missing several important business dinners and looking unreliable to his new employers. Robert would notice the negative industry chatter but wouldn't be able to trace it back to any specific source. Linda would deal with a series of miscommunications and computer glitches that would slowly erode her business reputation. By the time any of them realized they were under attack, I'd be long gone. Week 5 brought my first real victory. Derek was scheduled to take Victoria to San Francisco for a long weekend, one of those romantic getaways that she'd been posting about for weeks. They'd booked a suite at the St. Regis, made reservations at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, and planned a shopping expedition to Union Square. I waited until they were checking into their hotel to cancel the Chase Sapphire. This time I called the hotel directly. St. Regis, San Francisco. This is Marcus speaking. How may I assist you? Hi Marcus, this is calling from Chase Bank's Fraud Prevention Department. We've detected some unusual activity on one of our customers' accounts and need to verify a transaction. The cardholder is Derek Walker and he should be checking in today. Marcus was immediately concerned and helpful. Yes, Mr. Walker had just checked in. Yes, they'd charged his card for the full amount of his stay. Was there a problem? I'm afraid we've had to freeze Mr. Walker's account due to suspected fraudulent activity, I explained. The charge to your hotel has been reversed, and his card is no longer active. You'll need to collect alternate payment before allowing him access to his room. There was a pause. Oh my, this is quite unusual. Should I speak with Mr. Walker directly? That would be best. He should have been notified of the account freeze, but sometimes our text alerts are delayed. I'm sure he'll understand. I hung up and waited. Derek's panicked phone call came 20 minutes later. This time when the customer service number forwarded to my Google Voice line, I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail and listened to his increasingly frantic message about being humiliated at hotel and needing immediate assistance with his account. Victoria's Instagram told the rest of the story. Their romantic weekend was cut short when Derek couldn't provide alternate payment for their hotel suite. They'd been forced to book a room at a Holiday Inn near the airport and fly home early Sunday morning instead of Monday evening. Her last post from the trip was a blurry photo of a sad-looking airport sandwich, with the caption, "Sometimes plans change." Grateful for the time together anyway, the forced cheerfulness was almost painful to read. Derek tried calling the customer service number 17 more times over the next 3 days. I answered exactly once, on Wednesday afternoon, just to hear the desperation in his voice. Jennifer, thank God, I've been trying to reach someone for days. This is Derek Walker, account number ending in 4. Someone has been tampering with my account. I'm so sorry to hear about your troubles, Mr. Walker. Let me pull up your file. I made the appropriate typing sounds again. I showed that your account was closed on Friday, due to security concerns, and there have been multiple attempts to access it since then. For your protection, we've flagged your profile for additional verification. What kind of verification? You'll need to visit a branch location in person with 2 forms of government ID and proof of address. Unfortunately, this process can take 7 to 10 business days to complete. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Then, this is sabotage. Someone is doing this deliberately. Sir, I understand your frustration, but I can assure you that Chase takes account security very seriously. If you view someone has gained unauthorized access to your personal information, you should contact the police and file a fraud report. I know exactly who's doing this, Derek said, his voice low and angry. And when I prove it, there are going to be serious consequences. I hung up without responding, but his words sent a chill through me. Derek might be financially incompetent and emotionally stunted, but he wasn't stupid. If he was starting to connect the dots, I needed to accelerate my timeline. That night, I canceled his Citibank Platinum card and his 2 remaining store cards. I also began the process of disputing several large purchases he'd made in the previous month, claiming they were fraudulent charges that needed to be investigated. By Thursday morning, Derek had exactly 1 working credit card left, a basic Visa with a $3,000 limit that he probably hadn't used in years. But I wasn't done with him yet. I still had his corporate card, the one issued by Hartwell Pharmaceuticals for business expenses. That was going to require more finesse, but it would also cause the most damage. Losing personal credit cards was embarrassing. Losing access to company funds was career-ending. I spent Friday researching Hartwell's corporate policies and payment system. Like most large companies, they used a third-party provider to manage employee expense accounts. The cards were tied to specific employees, but monitored by the accounting department for unusual activity. What I needed was a way to trigger a fraud investigation, without immediately pointing back to Derek's personal financial problems. If Hartwell's accounting team thought Derek was misusing company funds, they'd freeze his access and launch an internal investigation. Even if he was eventually cleared, the damage to his professional reputation would be severe. The opportunity came sooner than I'd expected. Derek was scheduled to attend a pharmaceutical industry conference in Las Vegas the following week, the kind of event where company representatives spent freely on client entertainment and networking events. Victoria had already posted about their upcoming business trip, complete with photos of the dresses she'd packed for dinners and shows. I waited until Derek was at the airport to make my move. Using information I'd gathered from his social media posts and Victoria's Instagram, I called Hartwell's accounting department and reported suspicious activity on Derek Walker's corporate card. I explained that I was calling from the Bellagio Hotel's security department, and that we'd noticed unusual spending patterns on Mr. Walker's account that didn't match his registered business activities. The accounting representative was immediately concerned. I explained that Mr. Walker had made several large charges to adult entertainment venues and high-end jewelry stores, purchases that seemed inconsistent with pharmaceutical industry networking. The charges totaled nearly $8,000 over 2 days, well above his approved spending limit for the conference. I want to emphasize that we're not accusing Mr. Walker of wrongdoing, I said carefully. But our security protocols require us to report unusual spending patterns to the cardholder's company. We've seen cases where employees' cards were stolen or cloned at these types of events. The representative thanked me for calling and assured me that Hartwell would investigate immediately. Derek's corporate card would be temporarily suspended pending review, and he'd be contacted by his supervisor to discuss the charges. I hung up and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. Derek was now stranded in Las Vegas with minimal funds, a suspicious employer, and a girlfriend who was about to discover that their luxury vacation had just become a very expensive lesson in financial planning. But as satisfying as Derek's downfall was becoming, I knew I couldn't focus entirely on him. I had other targets, other scores to settle, and time was running out faster than I'd expected. My last chemotherapy session had been brutal, leaving me weak and nauseous for days. Dr. Martinez had gently suggested that we might want to consider stopping treatment and focusing on comfort care. The tumors weren't responding, and the side effects were becoming harder to manage. I'd agreed to discontinue chemo, but not because I was ready to give up. I was stopping because I needed my energy for more important things. I had a war to finish, and I couldn't afford to spend my remaining weeks too sick to fight. Week 6 was when everything started to accelerate. Derek had returned from Las Vegas early, his corporate card frozen, and his job in jeopardy. Victoria had stopped posting their adventures on Instagram, and her recent photos showed a strained smile that suggested their relationship was under serious stress. But Derek wasn't my only concern anymore. Linda's catering business was starting to experience the effects of my subtle sabotage. She'd missed 3 important deliveries due to the scheduling changes I'd made, and her Yelp reviews were starting to reflect customer dissatisfaction. More importantly, I'd begun leaving my own reviews under fake accounts, carefully crafted complaints about food quality and unprofessional service that were just believable enough to seem genuine. Robert Chen was dealing with his own professional problem. The negative industry chatter I'd generated was starting to affect his company's partnerships, and I'd heard through former colleagues that several potential deals had fallen through after prospective clients raised concerns about the company's management practices. But I was saving my most devastating attack for last, because while Derek, Linda, and Robert had all wronged me in their own ways, there was one person whose betrayal had cut deeper than all the others combined. My daughter Sophie. Sophie had chosen Derek's side during the divorce, believing his lies about my mental state and accepting his financial support while cutting me out of her life. She'd skipped my birthday for 3 years running, missed every holiday, and made it clear that she considered me an embarrassment to the family name. When I'd called to tell her about my diagnosis, she'd cried and promised to visit, but she hadn't followed through. She'd sent a few concerned text messages, but no visits, no real effort to repair our relationship. It was as if my terminal illness was just another inconvenience in her carefully ordered life. But Sophie had made one crucial mistake. She'd given me access to her financial accounts years earlier, back when she was in college, and I was helping her manage her student loans. She'd never bothered to remove my access, Probably never even thought about it. Sophie worked for a tech startup that was still in its early growth phase, the kind of company that operated on venture capital funding and grand promises about future profitability. Her salary was decent, but not spectacular, and she supplemented it with freelance design work and a modest trust fund that Derek had established for her during our marriage. What Sophie didn't know was that Derek had never legally removed my name from that trust, an oversight on his part, but one that gave me significant influence over her financial future. I spent the last days of week 6 researching Sophie's current financial situation, tracking her spending patterns and identifying the payments that were most crucial to her lifestyle. Her rent, her car payment, her student loan obligations, all automated, all dependent on maintaining sufficient funds in her checking account. The plan I developed was elegant in its simplicity. I wouldn't steal her money or destroy her credit. I would simply create enough confusion and delay in her automated payments to cause significant inconvenience and stress. Rent checks that bounced, car payments that were declined, student loan payments that triggered default warning. Nothing permanent, nothing that couldn't be fixed with time and effort, but enough chaos to make her understand what it felt like to have her carefully controlled world suddenly become unpredictable and frightening, just like she'd done to me when she'd chosen Derek's money over her mother's love. As I prepared to implement the final phase of my plan, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Dr. Martinez during my last appointment. She'd asked if there was anything I wanted to accomplish in my remaining weeks, any relationships I wanted to repair or experiences I wanted to have. I'd told her I was working on some unfinished business, which was true enough. But what I didn't tell her was that this unfinished business was giving my life more purpose and satisfaction than anything I'd done in years. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt powerful. I felt like I mattered. Every canceled credit card, every missed payment, every moment of confusion and frustration I created was proof that Inez Walker had existed, that I'd had an impact on the world. They'd all written me off as a dying woman, a victim to be pitied or ignored. But I wasn't dying quietly or passively. I was going out with a bang, and I was taking all of them down with me. The only question now was whether 6 months would be enough time to finish what I'd started. Week 7 arrived with unseasonably warm weather and the kind of clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. I'd stopped pretending to go to work, stopped returning calls from concerned colleagues, stopped maintaining the facade that I was fighting this diagnosis with grace and dignity. Instead, I'd transformed my dining room into a command center, complete with multiple laptops, printed account statements, and a detailed timeline of everyone's vulnerabilities mapped out across my kitchen table. The chemotherapy had left me gaunt and pale, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. Pain has a way of focusing your priorities, and mine had crystallized into something pure and simple: make them all pay for every slight, every betrayal, every moment. They'd made me feel small and powerless. Derek's situation was spiraling exactly as I'd planned. His corporate card suspension had triggered an internal investigation at Hartwell Pharmaceuticals, and according to my sources, former colleagues, who were all too happy to gossip about my ex-husband's professional troubles, he was now under formal review for potential misuse of company funds. The charges I'd fabricated during his Las Vegas trip had been thoroughly investigated and found to be legitimate, which meant Derek was on the hook for $8,000 in adult entertainment and jewelry purchases he'd never made. But the real beauty of Derek's downfall wasn't just the financial chaos, it was watching his carefully constructed image crumble in real time. Victoria had finally stopped posting their relationship highlights on Instagram, and when she did share photos, they were noticeably more subdued. Gone were the expensive restaurant check-ins and designer shopping hauls. Instead, she posted generic inspirational quotes about weathering storms together and true love overcoming challenges. I'd learned through my surveillance of their social media that Derek had been forced to move out of his upscale downtown apartment and into something significantly more modest. The Porsche lease had been terminated early, replaced by a used Honda that Victoria tried to make look glamorous in her posts, but failed miserably. Most satisfying of all, Derek had been forced to ask his parents for a loan, a humiliation that his prideful personality would struggle to endure. But Derek was just the appetizer. My main courses were yet to be served. Linda's catering business was experiencing what she described on her business Facebook page as a series of unfortunate technical difficulties. The scheduling changes I'd been making had cascaded into larger problems. Clients who received the wrong meals or had deliveries arrive at incorrect addresses weren't just annoyed, they were actively warning others about her supposed incompetence. Her 5-star Yelp rating had dropped to 3.2 stars, and she'd lost 2 major corporate accounts in the past week alone. The genius of Linda's destruction was that it appeared completely organic. No one suspected sabotage, because the failures seemed like normal business incompetence amplified by bad luck. When a wedding cake arrived 3 hours late because I'd changed the delivery time in her system, it looked like poor planning. When a corporate lunch was delivered to the wrong building because I'd modified a single digit in the address, it seemed like a data entry error. Linda had called me twice in the past week, something she hadn't done since my diagnosis. Both times I'd let it go to voicemail, listening later as she complained about her computer problems, and asked if I knew anyone who could help with her technical issue. The irony of my technology-phobic sister asking for my help while I was systematically destroying her business from the inside was almost too perfect. But Linda's professional troubles were nothing compared to what I had planned for Robert. Robert's pharmaceutical company had been quietly hemorrhaging partnerships for weeks, thanks to the negative industry chatter I'd been generating. But that was just the foundation. The real attack came when I discovered that Robert had been having an affair with his assistant, a 28-year-old named Patricia, who worked in his department and reported directly to him. I'd uncovered this information through the same digital carelessness that had made Robert vulnerable in the first place. His Facebook messages weren't encrypted, his email password was pathetically simple, and he'd been sloppy about covering his tracks. There were hotel receipts charged to his corporate card, dinner reservations for 2 during business trips where his wife wasn't present, and a series of text messages that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Robert's wife Margaret was a family law attorney with a reputation for being particularly ruthless in divorce proceedings. She was also active in their church and deeply involved in charitable organizations that valued moral integrity above all else. If Margaret discovered Robert's affair, especially the fact that it involved a subordinate employee, it wouldn't just end their marriage, it would destroy his professional reputation, and potentially result in sexual harassment charges. The question wasn't whether to expose Robert's affair but how to do it in a way that would cause maximum damage while protecting Patricia, who was clearly being exploited by someone in a position of power over her career. I decided to start with anonymous tips to Hartwell's Human Resources Department. Robert's company had strict policies about relationships between supervisors and subordinates, policies that Robert had obviously violated. An HR investigation would force the affair into the open and create a paper trail that Margaret would inevitably discover, but I wanted to ensure Margaret found out before Robert had a chance to control the narrative, so I also prepared a carefully documented package of evidence: printed email, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, and photos I'd found on Robert's phone that he'd carelessly backed up to his cloud storage. I planned to deliver this package to Margaret's law office with a simple note explaining that I thought she should know what her husband was doing during his business trips. The timing would be crucial. I wanted the HR investigation to begin on the same day that Margaret received her package, creating a crisis on both fronts that Robert would be completely unprepared to handle. But even as I orchestrated Robert's downfall, my thoughts kept returning to Sophie. My daughter's betrayal cut deeper than Derek's financial abuse or Linda's casual cruelty or Robert's professional vindictiveness. They were outsiders who'd hurt me, but Sophie was my blood, my legacy, the one person who should have stood by me, regardless of circumstance. Sophie's financial life was more complex than the others, but that complexity also created more opportunities for chaos. In addition to her regular salary and trust fund, she received quarterly payments from a freelance contract, annual bonuses tied to her company's performance, and irregular deposits from various side projects. Her financial stability depended on a carefully orchestrated dance of automated payments, scheduled transfers and manual deposits that kept her accounts balanced and her bills current. I'd spent days studying her banking patterns, identifying the critical timing windows where a delayed payment or missed transfer would cause the maximum disruption. Sophie lived paycheck to paycheck despite her decent income, a lifestyle choice that left her vulnerable to even minor financial interruptions. My plan for Sophie was more psychological than financial. I wasn't going to bankrupt her or destroy her credit. Instead, I was going to introduce uncertainty into her perfectly controlled world, the same kind of uncertainty she'd forced me to live with when she'd chosen Derek's money over our relationship. Sophie's rent was automatically deducted from her checking account on the 15th of each month. Her car payment came out on the 20th. Her student loan payment was scheduled for the 25th. These payments were the foundation of her financial stability, the automated transactions that allowed her to live without constantly monitoring her account balance. But what would happen if those payments started failing? What if her rent check bounced because a freelance payment was delayed? What if her car payment was declined because her trust fund transfer didn't arrive on schedule? What if her student loan went into default because of a technical error in the automatic payment system? Nothing permanent, nothing that couldn't be resolved with phone calls and explanations and follow-up payment, but enough disruption to make her understand what it felt like to have your security undermined by forces beyond your control. The beauty of this approach was that Sophie would never suspect deliberate sabotage. Financial institutions were notorious for technical glitches and processing delay. Freelance clients were always late with payments. Trust fund administrators made mistakes all the time. Each individual incident would seem like normal bad luck, but the cumulative effect would be devastating to someone who'd built their life around financial predictability. I started with Sophie's trust fund, using my access to delay her monthly transfer by 3 days, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but sufficient to throw off her carefully calculated account balance. Then I contacted her biggest freelance client, claiming to be Sophie and requesting that they hold her next payment for tax purposes until the following month. Within 48 hours, Sophie's checking account balance had dropped to a critically low level, just as her rent payment was scheduled to process. I waited until the exact moment her rent check would bounce, then called her bank's customer service line. "Hi, this is Sophie Walker," I said, using the voice coaching techniques I'd learned during my marketing career to sound like my daughter. "I need to report a potential fraud issue with my account. Someone may have gained access to my trust fund information." The customer service representative was immediately concerned and helpful. They placed a temporary hold on all automated transactions pending a fraud investigation, which meant Sophie's rent payment wouldn't just bounce, it would be flagged as potentially fraudulent activity. I hung up and waited for the chaos to begin. Sophie's panicked phone call came 6 hours later. I let it go to voicemail, listening as she explained that her bank account had been frozen, her rent payment had been rejected, and her landlord was threatening eviction proceedings. She sounded confused and frightened, qualities I hadn't heard in her voice since she was a child. "Mom, I know we haven't talked much lately," her voicemail continued, "but I really need some advice. My bank says there might be fraud on my account, and I don't know what to do. Could you call me back, please?" I deleted the voicemail without responding. Sophie had made her choice years ago when she'd decided that Derek's financial support was more valuable than her relationship with her mother. Now she could experience what it felt like to be abandoned during a crisis. But Sophie's troubles were just beginning. Over the next few days, I systematically disrupted every aspect of her financial life that I could access. Her car payment was declined due to insufficient funds. Her student loan payment triggered a default warning because of the bank account freeze. Her credit score took a hit when her cell phone bill went unpaid because her automatic payment system wasn't functioning. Each individual problem was small and fixable, but together they created a cascade of stress and uncertainty that Sophie was completely unprepared to handle. She'd never experienced financial instability, never had to worry about money, or negotiate with creditors or explain late payments to landlords. Derek had shielded her from those realities during her childhood, and her trust fund had protected her as an adult. Now, for the first time in her privileged life, Sophie was learning what it felt like to be vulnerable.
The truly satisfying part was watching her relationship with Derek deteriorate under the pressure. Derek was dealing with his own financial crisis and couldn't provide the support that Sophie had come to expect. When she called him for help, he had to explain that his credit cards were maxed out and his corporate account was frozen. The father she'd chosen over her mother was proving to be just as unreliable as I'd always known he was. By the end of week 7, all of my targets were struggling with problems that seemed unrelated but were actually part of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Derek was facing potential job loss and criminal charges. Linda's business was collapsing under the weight of apparent incompetence. Robert was about to be exposed as an adulterer and sexual harasser. Sophie was drowning in financial chaos that threatened every aspect of her carefully controlled life. But I wasn't finished yet. The most devastating attacks were still to come. Week 8 began with news that should have been sobering but instead filled me with renewed energy. Dr. Martinez called to inform me that my latest scans showed accelerated tumor growth. The cancer was spreading faster than anticipated, and she estimated that I had perhaps 6 weeks left, maybe less. Nin, she said gently, it's time to start thinking about end-of-life arrangement. Do you have family members who should be notified? Are there any affairs you need to put in order? I assured her that my affairs were very much in order, more organized than they'd ever been in my life. What I didn't tell her was that I was running out of time to complete my mission, which meant I needed to accelerate my timeline and unleash the most destructive phases of my plan. Derek's situation reached a critical point that Tuesday when Hartwell Pharmaceuticals made the decision to terminate his employment pending the outcome of their fraud investigation. The $8,000 in fabricated charges had been thoroughly documented, and Derek couldn't provide any credible explanation for how they'd appeared on his corporate card. His protests about sabotage and identity theft were dismissed as desperate attempts to avoid responsibility. But losing his job was just the beginning of Derek's problems. The fraud investigation had triggered a review of his personal finances, which revealed the suspicious closure of multiple credit card accounts and the unusual pattern of contact information changes. Financial institutions were now treating Derek as a potential fraud victim, which meant all of his remaining accounts were subject to additional scrutiny and verification requirements. The irony was perfect. Derek's financial life had become so complicated by my sabotage that legitimate institutions now viewed him as a security risk. Every transaction was questioned, every new account application was denied, every attempt to restore his credit was met with suspicion and delay. Victoria's response to Derek's job loss was swift and predictable. Her Instagram posts became increasingly vague and philosophical, focusing on personal growth and new chapters rather than relationship content. Within days, she'd moved back in with her parents and was posting photos of herself at bars with groups of single friends. Derek was now unemployed, financially ruined, and abandoned by the woman he'd been supporting for the past year.
Margaret was well connected and respected, and her version of events, supported by documented evidence of Robert's infidelity, became the accepted narrative. Robert would never work in the pharmaceutical industry again, at least not in any significant capacity. His marriage was over, his finances were ruined by legal fees and alimony obligations, and his professional network had turned against him. The man who'd callously discarded me when I became inconvenient was now experiencing his own professional and personal exile. But even as I celebrated these victories, my attention remained focused on Sophie. Her financial chaos had escalated exactly as I'd planned, but I wanted her to understand that these weren't random misfortunes, they were consequences of her choices. Sophie's bank account remained frozen pending the fraud investigation I'd initiated, which meant she couldn't access her regular income or trust fund payments. Her rent was 3 weeks overdue, her car had been repossessed due to missed payments, and her student loans were officially in default. The credit score she'd worked years to build was in free fall, and her ability to secure new housing or transportation was severely compromised. More importantly, Sophie's relationship with Derek had completely deteriorated. When she'd called him for financial help, he'd been forced to admit that he was unemployed and facing potential criminal charges. The stable, successful father figure she'd chosen over her mother had revealed himself to be weak and unreliable when she needed him most. Sophie had left me 17 voicemails over the past 2 weeks, each one more desperate than the last. She'd progressed from asking for advice to begging for loans, to simply pleading for me to call her back. The confident, independent woman who'd dismissed me as mentally unstable was learning what it felt like to be powerless and alone. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. Sophie needed to understand the full extent of her vulnerability before I showed her who was responsible for her suffering. The opportunity came when Sophie's landlord filed formal eviction proceedings. Washington state law required specific notification procedures for evictions, which meant Sophie had exactly 30 days to resolve her rental arrears or face forced removal from her apartment. Sophie's panic was evident in her social media posts, which had shifted from professional design showcases to increasingly frantic requests for financial advice and temporary housing options. Her carefully curated Instagram aesthetic had been replaced by raw desperation that her professional network was beginning to notice. I decided it was time for the final revelation. On Thursday evening, I called Sophie directly for the first time since her bank account had been frozen. She answered on the first ring, her voice breathless with hope and relief. "Mom! Oh my God! I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Everything is falling apart and I don't know what to do." "I know exactly what's happening, Sophie," I said calmly. "Every single problem you're experiencing right now is my doing." There was silence on the other end of the line. "Then what do you mean?" I explained everything. The trust fund delays, the bank fraud report, the payment disruptions, the communication breakdown. I detailed each act of sabotage with the same methodical precision I'd once used in marketing presentations. Sophie's breathing became shallow and rapid as she processed what I was telling her. "You did this. You ruined my credit and got me evicted. Why would you do this to me?" "Because you chose Derek over me," I said simply. "You believed his lies about my mental state, you accepted his financial support while cutting me out of your life, and you treated me like I was disposable. Now you're learning what it feels like to be abandoned by the people who are supposed to love you." Sophie started crying, deep sobs that carried years of accumulated guilt and pain. "Mom, I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But I was young and scared and Dad convinced me that you were unstable," I interrupted. "Mentally ill. Dangerous. Yes, I remember his version of events. The same version you chose to believe without ever asking for my side of the story." "I'm sorry," Sophie whispered. "I'm so sorry. Can you help me fix this? Can you undo what you've done?" I paused, savoring the moment of complete power over the daughter who'd rejected me. "Sophie, I'm dying. I have maybe a month left, probably less. You've spent 3 years treating me like I don't exist, and now you want my help because you're finally experiencing consequence." "Please," Sophie begged. "I'll do anything. I'll make it up to you, just please help me." "There's nothing to make up," I said. "You made your choice years ago and I've made mine. You wanted Derek's version of family loyalty. Well, now you can see how much that's worth when things get difficult." I hung up without saying goodbye, leaving Sophie to contemplate the ruins of her carefully constructed life. Week 9 brought unexpected developments that accelerated my timeline in ways I hadn't anticipated. My physical condition deteriorated rapidly, leaving me weak and nauseous most days. But my mental clarity remained sharp, focused by the knowledge that my mission was nearly complete. Derek's situation had progressed from professional embarrassment to potential criminal liability. The fraud investigation at Hartwell had uncovered evidence of the fabricated charges, but Derek's inability to provide a credible explanation had convinced investigators that he was lying about his involvement. The district attorney's office was considering filing criminal charges for corporate fraud and embezzlement. Derek's parents had hired a criminal defense attorney, but the lawyer's initial assessment was pessimistic. The evidence was substantial and well documented. Derek's explanations were inconsistent and implausible, and his financial behavior showed patterns that suggested deliberate deception rather than victimization. The irony was that Derek was actually telling the truth about being sabotaged, but the sabotage had been so thoroughly executed that it appeared to be his own criminal activity. Every canceled credit card, every changed contact detail, every fraudulent charge had been carefully designed to look like Derek's deliberate actions, rather than external interference. Linda's business had officially declared bankruptcy by the end of week 9. The combination of canceled contracts, negative reviews, and operational chaos had made it impossible for her to meet her financial obligations. She'd been forced to sell her catering equipment, terminate her employees, and close the commercial kitchen she'd operated for 8 years. Linda's personal finances were equally devastated. Without business income, she couldn't afford her mortgage payments, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on her house. The sister who'd lectured me about taking responsibility for my problems was learning what it felt like to lose everything through circumstances beyond her control. Robert's life had become a cautionary tale that was whispered about in pharmaceutical industry circles. His divorce was proceeding through the courts, with Margaret demanding maximum alimony and asset division. The sexual harassment investigation at his former company had resulted in formal charges and a recommendation for criminal prosecution. Robert had been forced to move into a studio apartment and take a minimum wage job at a retail pharmacy, a humiliating fall from his former executive position. His professional network had completely abandoned him, and his name had become synonymous with corruption and moral failure. But the most satisfying development was Sophie's complete emotional breakdown. Her eviction had proceeded as scheduled, forcing her to move in with friends who were growing tired of supporting someone who couldn't contribute to household expenses. Her career was suffering because she couldn't focus on work while dealing with financial crisis, and her professional reputation was being damaged by her obvious instability. Sophie had called me 12 more times since our confrontational conversation, leaving increasingly desperate messages that revealed the depth of her psychological unraveling. She alternated between begging for forgiveness and demanding that I fix the problems I'd created, unable to accept that actions have consequences and that some damage can't be undone. The most recent voicemail had been particularly satisfying. "Mom, I know you're angry, but this is insane. You're destroying my life over something that happened years ago. I was just a kid, and I made mistakes, but this is crazy. You're literally ruining everything I've worked for. Please just call me back. Please." I saved the message but didn't respond. Sophie was finally experiencing the same abandonment and helplessness that I'd felt when she'd chosen Derek's money over our relationship. The difference was that my suffering had been caused by betrayal from the people who were supposed to love me, while hers was the natural consequence of her own choices. As week 9 drew to a close, I realized that my mission was essentially complete. Derek, Linda, Robert, and Sophie had all been brought low by their own weaknesses and moral failures. I'd simply created the circumstances that revealed their true characters and exposed the fragility of their carefully constructed lives. Derek's arrogance and financial irresponsibility had made him vulnerable to credit sabotage. Linda's technological incompetence and superior attitude had enabled the destruction of her business. Robert's sexual misconduct and professional hubris had provided the foundation for his downfall. Sophie's emotional immaturity and misplaced loyalty had left her unprepared for real adversity. I hadn't destroyed them. I'd simply removed the protective barriers that had shielded them from the consequences of their actions. Derek's treatment of me during our marriage had revealed his true character long before I'd canceled his credit cards. Linda's dismissive attitude toward my struggles had shown her lack of empathy years before I'd sabotaged her scheduling system. Robert's willingness to discard sick employees had demonstrated his moral bankruptcy before I'd exposed his affair. Sophie's choice to believe Derek's lies about my mental state had illustrated her weakness before I'd disrupted her finance. All I'd done was create situations where their true natures could be fully revealed. As I prepared for what I knew would be my final weeks, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. For years, these people had treated me as disposable, someone whose feelings and well-being didn't matter as long as their own lives remained comfortable and secure. Now they all understood what it felt like to be powerless, to have their security threatened by forces beyond their control, to be abandoned by the people they'd counted on for support. They were experiencing the same fear and uncertainty that I'd lived with since my divorce, the same sense of vulnerability that had defined my existence since my diagnosis. The difference was that their suffering was temporary and self-inflicted, while mine had been permanent and undeserved. They could rebuild their lives, repair their relationships, and learn from their mistakes. I would be dead within weeks, my voice silenced forever. But at least I'd made sure that voice was heard one last time, that my existence had left a mark on the world that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. And Inez Walker might be dying, but she wasn't disappearing quietly. Week 10 arrived with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. The cancer had spread to my liver and lungs, making even simple tasks like brewing coffee feel monumental. But my mind remained razor-sharp, fueled by a combination of prescription painkillers and pure vindictive energy. I had perhaps 2 weeks left, maybe 3 if I was stubborn enough, and there were still loose ends to tie up. The beautiful thing about systematic destruction is that it builds momentum. Each small catastrophe creates conditions for larger ones. Each lie requires additional lies to maintain. Each act of desperation opens new vulnerabilities. My targets weren't just dealing with the specific problems I'd created, they were struggling with the cascading effects of those problems, the way one area of chaos infected every other aspect of their lives. Derek's criminal defense attorney had advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than risk trial. The evidence of corporate fraud was overwhelming, and Derek's inability to provide credible explanations for his spending patterns made conviction almost certain. The prosecutor was offering 2 years in minimum security prison, plus full restitution to Hartwell Pharmaceuticals in exchange for a guilty plea. Derek was fighting the recommendation, insisting to anyone who would listen that he was the victim of an elaborate identity theft scheme. But his protests sounded increasingly desperate and paranoid, especially since he couldn't identify who might have targeted him or explain how they'd gained access to his financial information. The man who'd once prided himself on his logical approach to problems had been reduced to spinning conspiracy theories that made him sound mentally unstable. The irony was exquisite. Derek had spent years portraying me as emotionally unbalanced, using my occasional outbursts and justified anger as evidence that I couldn't be trusted or taken seriously. Now he was the one ranting about hidden enemies and elaborate plots, while I remained calm and methodical in my destruction of his life. Victoria had officially ended their relationship the previous week, posting a carefully worded Instagram message about choosing personal growth over toxic situations and prioritizing emotional health. The subtext was clear to anyone who knew their situation. She was distancing herself from Derek's legal troubles and financial ruin before they could damage her own reputation. Derek was now living in his parents' basement, a 52-year-old man reduced to the same living arrangements he'd had in high school. His mother had called me twice, leaving voicemails that started accusatory but became pleading as she detailed Derek's deteriorating mental state. She suspected that I was somehow involved in his troubles but couldn't prove it, and her desperation was evident in her voice. I deleted her messages without responding. Derek's mother had never liked me during our marriage, treating me like an inferior addition to their family bloodline. She'd supported Derek's version of events during our divorce and had poisoned Sophie against me with stories about my supposed instability. Now she could experience what it felt like to watch helplessly as someone she loved self-destructed. Linda's situation had progressed from professional failure to complete social isolation. The foreclosure on her house had been finalized, forcing her to move into a cramped apartment in a part of town she'd previously considered beneath her standard. Her social circle, built largely around business connections and church relationships, had evaporated along with her financial stability, but Linda's emotional breakdown was more satisfying than her material loss. She'd built her identity around being the successful sister, the one who'd made smart choices and built a stable business while I'd struggled through divorce and career setbacks. Now she was the family failure, and the reversal was devastating to her sense of self. Linda had started drinking heavily, something I'd learned through mutual acquaintances who'd noticed her increasingly erratic behavior at social events. She'd been asked to step down from her volunteer positions at church after showing up intoxicated to a charity function. Her carefully maintained image as a pillar of the community was crumbling along with everything else. The most delicious part was that Linda had no idea why her life was falling apart. Unlike Derek, who suspected sabotage but couldn't prove it, Linda genuinely believed that she was experiencing a string of unrelated misfortune. She'd convinced herself that she was cursed or that God was testing her faith, never imagining that her loving sister was systematically destroying her from the inside. Linda had left me a drunken voicemail the night before, slurring her words as she begged for a loan to help her get back on her feet.
She promised to pay me back once she figured out what went wrong with her business, as if her failures were mysterious accidents rather than calculated sabotage. I saved the message but didn't respond. Linda could experience the same financial terror and social abandonment that she'd dismissed when I'd needed help after my divorce. She could learn what it felt like to have her carefully constructed world crumble while her family ignored her pleas for support. Robert's destruction had taken on a life of its own, spreading through Portland's professional community like a virus. The sexual harassment charges had been filed formally, and the local business journal had run a story about his case that was picked up by industry publications. Robert's name was now associated with corporate corruption and sexual misconduct in Google searches, making him essentially unemployable in any professional capacity. Margaret's divorce proceedings had become a masterclass in legal warfare. She'd hired one of Portland's most aggressive family law attorneys, and was pursuing maximum asset division, spousal support, and punitive damages. Robert's affair with a subordinate employee had given Margaret significant leverage, and she was using it ruthlessly. Robert had been forced to liquidate his retirement accounts to pay legal fees, and his attorney had warned him that he was likely to lose his house, his savings, and most of his future income to alimony obligations. The man who'd callously discarded sick employees to protect his bottom line was learning what it felt like to have his own financial security destroyed by legal proceedings. But Robert's professional exile was the most complete of all my victories. The pharmaceutical industry was relatively small and tightly networked, which meant news of his misconduct had spread quickly through professional circles. Former colleagues avoided him at industry events. Business partners canceled existing contracts, and potential employers wouldn't return his call. Robert had been reduced to working at a chain pharmacy, filling prescriptions for minimum wage while wearing a name tag that identified him as a pharmacy technician. The former executive who'd once made decisions affecting thousands of employees was now taking orders from managers half his age, and apologizing to customers who complained about wait times. The humiliation was exactly what Robert deserved, but I wasn't finished with him yet. I'd discovered that Robert had been embezzling small amounts from his former company's expense accounts, hiding personal purchases among legitimate business expenses. The amounts were relatively small, a few $100s here and there, but they represented a pattern of dishonesty that would add criminal fraud charges to his existing legal problem. I'd documented Robert's embezzlement carefully, collecting receipts and cross-referencing expense reports with his personal spending pattern. The evidence would be devastating if it reached the right authorities, adding years to any potential prison sentence, and ensuring that his professional reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery. But I was saving Robert's final humiliation for later. I wanted him to think that his punishment was nearly complete before I delivered the killing blow that would send him to prison. Sophie's psychological collapse had accelerated beyond anything I'd anticipated. The confident, independent woman who'd dismissed me as mentally unstable was now displaying signs of actual mental breakdown. Her social media posts had become increasingly erratic and paranoid, alternating between desperate pleas for help and angry rants about financial terrorism. Sophie had figured out that her problems weren't coincidental, but she hadn't yet realized that I was responsible. Instead, she'd convinced herself that Derek was somehow orchestrating her destruction, as punishment for not supporting him during his legal trouble. The accusation had caused a complete breakdown in their relationship, with Derek insisting that he was too busy dealing with his own problems to sabotage anyone else. Sophie's professional life had disintegrated along with her personal finance. Her inability to focus on work while dealing with constant financial crises had resulted in missed deadlines and client complaints. Her employer had placed her on unpaid leave pending a performance review, effectively ending her income stream just when she needed it most. The apartment she'd moved into after her eviction was in a dangerous part of Seattle, the kind of neighborhood where car break-ins were routine, and domestic violence calls echoed through thin walls. Sophie's Instagram posts from her new living situation were desperate attempts to maintain her previous aesthetic, but the gritty reality kept breaking through her carefully filtered facade. Sophie had started seeing a therapist, something I'd learned through her social media posts about seeking professional help during difficult transition. The irony wasn't lost on me that my daughter was paying for mental health treatment while I, the woman she'd dismissed as crazy, was orchestrating her destruction with perfect clarity and methodical precision. But Sophie's therapy sessions were giving her insights that I found troubling. She'd started posting about toxic family patterns and generational trauma, using language that suggested she was beginning to understand the dysfunction that had defined our family for years. More dangerously, she was starting to question Derek's version of events surrounding our divorce. I needed to accelerate Sophie's destruction before she gained enough perspective to piece together what was really happening. The revelation of my responsibility needed to come at the moment of her complete collapse, not when she was developing the emotional tools to process and recover from trauma. The opportunity came when Sophie's therapist recommended that she reach out to family members for support during her crisis. Sophie had called me again, but this time her voice was different, stronger, more analytical, less desperate. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past few years," she said in her voicemail. "My therapist says that family trauma often gets passed down through generations, and that people sometimes act out their pain in destructive ways. I know I hurt you when I chose Dad's side during the divorce, and I'm wondering if what's happening to me now is connected to that somehow." The message was insightful and mature, showing emotional growth that could eventually lead to genuine healing and reconciliation. I couldn't allow that to happen. Sophie needed to understand that her suffering was punishment, not therapy, and that some betrayals couldn't be forgiven or forgot. I decided to reveal my involvement immediately, before Sophie could develop the emotional resilience to handle the truth constructively. I called her back that evening, choosing a time when I knew she'd be alone in her dangerous apartment, probably anxious about her safety and future. "Sophie, this is your mother. I got your voicemail about family trauma and generational patterns." "Mom," Sophie's voice was full of relief and hope, "I'm so glad you called back. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realized that I made some terrible mistake. I want to try to repair our relationship before." She stopped herself, probably remembering my diagnosis. "Before I die," I finished. "Yes, I imagine you would want to clear your conscience before I'm gone. That's very convenient timing for your emotional growth." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing my cold tone. "Mom, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I was young and scared, and Dad convinced me that you were dangerous, unstable." "Yes, I remember his propaganda campaign."
Now you're experiencing what it feels like to have your security destroyed by someone you trusted. "But I was just a kid," Sophie screamed. "I was 23 years old and my parents were getting divorced, and Dad told me that you were having a breakdown. I didn't know what to believe." "You believed what was convenient," I said calmly. "You believed the version that came with a trust fund and financial security. You chose money over loyalty, just like your father taught you." Sophie was sobbing now, deep wails that probably disturbed her neighbors in the thin-walled apartment. "Please, stop this. Please, fix what you've done. I'll do anything to make up for hurting you, but please, don't destroy my life over a mistake I made when I was young and stupid." "There's nothing to fix," I said. "You're experiencing the natural consequences of your choices. The difference is that my suffering was permanent, while yours can be temporary if you're willing to work for it." "What do you want from me?" Sophie asked desperately. "Do you want me to beg? Do you want me to admit that I was wrong? I'll do whatever you need. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, and that some damage can't be undone with apologies and good intentions. You spent 3 years treating me like I was dead, so now you can spend the rest of your life knowing that your mother died hating you." I hung up without saying goodbye, leaving Sophie to contemplate the wreckage of her life and the knowledge that her own mother had orchestrated her destruction. The next morning brought news that accelerated my timeline in unexpected ways. Martinez called to inform me that my condition had deteriorated more rapidly than anticipated. The tumors were affecting my liver function, and she estimated that I had perhaps a week left, possibly less. "Inez, you need to be in the hospital," she said gently. We can manage your pain more effectively and ensure that you're comfortable during your final days. I thanked her but declined hospitalization. I had too much work left to finish, and I couldn't complete my mission from a hospital bed surrounded by well-meaning nurses and grief counselors. Instead, I used my remaining energy to finalize the most devastating attacks I'd been preparing. Derek's plea bargain hearing was scheduled for the following week, but I wanted to ensure that he faced additional charges that would make any deal impossible. I contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing detailed documentation of Derek's supposed involvement in a complex identity theft and credit fraud scheme. The evidence I'd fabricated was thorough and convincing, showing patterns of financial manipulation that extended far beyond the charges he was already facing. The federal investigation would take months to resolve, during which Derek would remain under criminal suspicion and essentially unemployable. Even if he was eventually cleared of the federal charges, the investigation would destroy any chance of rebuilding his career or reputation. I also sent the evidence of Robert's embezzlement to the district attorney's office, along with a detailed analysis showing how his theft had affected employee pension funds and healthcare benefits. The additional charges would add years to any potential sentence and ensure that Robert's professional exile became permanent imprisonment. But my most satisfying final act was revealing the complete scope of my campaign to all my targets simultaneously. I wanted them to understand that their suffering wasn't random misfortune or unrelated coincidences. It was the deliberate result of a carefully planned campaign by someone they'd underestimated and discarded. I wrote detailed letters to Derek, Linda, Robert, and Sophie, explaining exactly how I'd orchestrated their destruction and why they deserved every moment of suffering they'd experienced. Each letter was personalized, referencing specific moments when they'd hurt or betrayed me, and connecting those actions to the particular punishments I'd designed for them. Derek's letter detailed how his financial arrogance and emotional abuse during our marriage had made him vulnerable to credit sabotage. Linda's letter explained how her dismissive attitude toward my struggles had enabled the destruction of her business through the same technological incompetence she'd mocked in others. Robert's letter described how his willingness to discard sick employees had led to his own professional destruction through the exposure of his moral failure. Sophie's letter outlined how her choice to believe Derek's lies had resulted in the same powerlessness and abandonment that I'd experienced after our divorce. Each letter ended with the same message: you thought I was weak and disposable, someone whose feelings didn't matter as long as your own lives remained comfortable. Now you know what it feels like to be powerless, and you'll carry that knowledge for the rest of your lives while I rest in peace, knowing that justice was served. I mailed the letters on Tuesday, timing their delivery for Thursday when I expected to be too weak to enjoy their responses directly, but knowing that my words would haunt them for years to come. The physical deterioration accelerated faster than even Dr. Martinez had predicted. By Wednesday evening, I could barely stand without assistance, and my vision had become blurry and intermittent, but my mind remained clear enough to monitor the chaos I'd created through news reports and social media updates. Derek's federal investigation had been announced in the local business journal, with unnamed law enforcement sources, describing it as a complex financial fraud case with potential organized crime connection. Derek's parents had hired a federal criminal defense attorney, depleting their retirement savings to fund legal fees that would ultimately prove futile. Robert's additional embezzlement charges had been filed with great fanfare, with the district attorney's office describing his case as an example of systematic corporate corruption that victimized hardworking employees. Robert was now facing a minimum of 5 years in federal prison, with the possibility of additional charges as investigators dug deeper into his financial activity. Linda's mental breakdown had accelerated after receiving my letter, with neighbors reporting disturbing behavior that included screaming matches with invisible opponents and obsessive checking of her apartment's locks and windows. She'd been placed on psychiatric hold after threatening suicide, though I suspected her threats were manipulative rather than genuine. Sophie's response to my letter had been the most dramatic. She'd posted a series of increasingly unhinged Instagram stories, detailing her mother's sociopathic campaign of financial terrorism and calling for help from anyone who understands what it's like to be abused by a malignant narcissist. Her accusations were accurate but sounded so extreme that most people dismissed them as the ramblings of someone experiencing a mental breakdown. The beautiful irony was that Sophie's desperate attempts to expose my campaign only made her sound more unstable, reinforcing the image of emotional instability that Derek had created years earlier. The truth was so outrageous that it couldn't be believed, which meant my reputation would remain intact while Sophie's credibility was destroyed. By Thursday afternoon, I was too weak to leave my bed, but I could still access my phone and laptop to monitor the final stages of my campaign. The chaos I'd created was self-sustaining now, with each victim's problems creating new complications that would persist long after my death. Derek would spend years fighting federal charges while struggling with the professional and personal isolation that comes with being publicly accused of major crime. Even if he was eventually cleared, his reputation would never recover, and he'd spend the rest of his life as a cautionary tale about the dangers of financial irresponsibility. Linda would rebuild her life eventually, but the trauma of losing everything would haunt her for years. She'd never regain the confidence and superior attitude that had defined her personality, and she'd always wonder what invisible forces might be working against her. Robert would serve his prison sentence and emerge as a registered sex offender with no prospects for professional rehabilitation. His former wealth and status would be permanently replaced by the stigma of criminal conviction and sexual misconduct. Sophie would recover from her immediate financial problems, but she'd carry the knowledge that her own mother had orchestrated her destruction out of pure hatred. The guilt and psychological damage would affect every relationship she formed for the rest of her life. As Thursday evening approached and my consciousness became increasingly intermittent, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with forgiveness or reconciliation. I'd used my final weeks to ensure that every person who'd wronged me understood the consequences of their actions. They'd all learned what it felt like to be powerless, abandoned and destroyed by forces beyond their control. Most importantly, they'd learned that Inez Walker was not the weak, disposable woman they'd imagined. I'd been underestimated and discarded, but I'd used that dismissal as cover for a campaign of destruction that was more thorough and devastating than any of them could have imagined. They'd wanted me gone, and soon I would be, but I wouldn't be forgotten, and they'd spend the rest of their lives remembering exactly what happened when they crossed someone who had nothing left to lose. Friday morning brought visitors I hadn't expected and didn't want. Derek's mother, Patricia, arrived first, her face drawn and aged by stress I'd helped create. She stood on my doorstep clutching a manila envelope like it contained evidence of war crimes, which in a way, it did. "I know what you've done," she said without preamble, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "I know you've been destroying Derek's life, and I have proof." I let her inside, partly from curiosity and partly because I was too weak to stand in the doorway much longer. Patricia followed me to the living room, where I settled into my recliner and waited for her accusations. "Derek hired a private investigator," Patricia continued, opening her envelope and spreading papers across my coffee table. "Credit card statements, phone records, bank transactions, everything points back to you." I examined the documents with genuine interest. Derek's investigator had done impressive work, tracing many of the financial disruptions back to their sources and identifying patterns that suggested coordinated sabotage. But the investigation had one crucial flaw: it couldn't prove that I was responsible for actions that appeared to be Derek's own mistakes. "This is fascinating," I said, reading through a timeline that accurately mapped most of my activities. "But what exactly does it prove?" "That Derek made poor financial decisions and then hired someone to blame his ex-wife for his problems." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "You systematically destroyed his credit, sabotaged his job, and framed him for fraud. You're a sick, vindictive woman who can't accept that her marriage failed." "My marriage failed because Derek was emotionally abusive and financially controlling," I replied calmly. "Everything that's happened to him since our divorce is the natural consequence of his own character flaws." Patricia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've done. The police, the courts, his attorneys. You're not going to get away with this." I smiled, feeling a rush of energy that surprised me given my deteriorating condition. "Patricia, I'm dying. I have maybe 3 days left.
possibly less. What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish by exposing me now? The question seemed to deflate her and she sat back in her chair looking suddenly lost. You've destroyed my son's life for revenge. Don't you feel any remorse? I feel satisfaction, I said honestly. Derek spent 22 years making me feel powerless and insignificant. Now he knows what that feels like, and he'll carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. Patricia gathered her papers with shaking hands. You're a monster. Derek was right about you being mentally ill. Derek was many things, but he was rarely right, I replied. And if I'm mentally ill, what does that say about his judgment in marrying me and having a child with me? Patricia left without another word, but her visit had been illuminating. Derek's investigation was more thorough than I'd anticipated, which meant other targets might be conducting their own research into my activity. I needed to prepare for additional confrontations while I still had the strength to enjoy them. The next visitor arrived that afternoon, Robert Chen's soon-to-be ex-wife Margaret. Unlike Patricia's emotional theatrics, Margaret's approach was coldly professional, the demeanor of someone accustomed to handling complex legal battles. Mrs. Walker, she said, settling into my living room with the confidence of someone who belonged there. I believe we have some things to discuss. Margaret was elegant and composed, exactly the kind of woman who would destroy her cheating husband methodically rather than dramatically. She opened a leather portfolio and extracted several documents, arranging them on my coffee table with practiced precision. I've been investigating the source of the information about Robert's affair, she said. Anonymous packages don't usually contain such thoroughly documented evidence unless the sender has specific expertise in gathering that type of material. I studied Margaret's evidence, which included detailed analyses of my techniques for accessing Robert's digital accounts and correlating his spending patterns with his personal activity. She'd hired a forensic accountant and a cybersecurity specialist, both of whom had identified digital fingerprints that led back to my campaign. You did excellent work, Margaret continued. Professional quality documentation, perfect timing, strategic presentation. The question is why you went to such trouble to destroy someone you barely knew. Robert fired me because I became a liability when I got sick, I said. He made it clear that employees who couldn't perform at full capacity were expendable. I simply returned the favor. Margaret nodded approvingly, a reasonable response. Robert's treatment of sick employees was morally reprehensible, though perfectly legal. Your methods were more creative than litigation would have been. Are you here to threaten me like Derek's mother did? Quite the opposite, Margaret said, a slight smile playing at her lips. I wanted to thank you. Robert's affair gave me significant leverage in our divorce proceedings, but your additional evidence of his embezzlement activities has made my position unassailable. Robert will lose everything, including his freedom. I found myself genuinely impressed by Margaret's pragmatic approach to revenge. She'd used my sabotage as a foundation for her own systematic destruction of Robert's life, turning his moral failures into legal weapons that would devastate him far more thoroughly than my original plan. You're not concerned about the ethics of accepting evidence from criminal activity. Margaret's smile widened. Robert's embezzlement was genuine criminal activity that harmed innocent employees. You simply documented existing crimes rather than creating new ones. From a legal perspective, you performed a public service, and from a personal perspective, you gave me the tools to destroy the man who betrayed our marriage and abused his professional authority. I consider that a gift. Margaret packed her documents and prepared to leave, but she paused at the door. I understand you have a terminal diagnosis. If there's anything you need during your final days, please don't hesitate to contact me. Professional courtesy between fellow strategists. After Margaret left, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected alliance she'd offered. Throughout my campaign, I'd assumed that exposing my targets would isolate me further and reinforce my position as the villain in their personal narratives. Instead, Margaret had recognized my actions as justified responses to genuine wrongdoing. The realization made me wonder if other people might view my campaign differently than I'd expected. Derek, Linda, and Sophie saw my sabotage as proof of my mental instability, but Margaret recognized it as evidence of strategic intelligence applied to legitimate grievances. That evening brought a call from someone I hadn't heard from in years, my former colleague Jennifer Morrison, who'd worked with me at the pharmaceutical company before leaving to start her own consulting firm. Inez, Jennifer said, her voice warm with genuine affection, I heard about your diagnosis, and I wanted to check on you. How are you holding up? I'm dying, I said matter-of-factly, but I'm making good use of my remaining time. Jennifer laughed, a sound I'd missed more than I'd realized. That sounds like you, always finding ways to stay productive even in impossible situations. We talked for an hour about work, mutual acquaintances, and the pharmaceutical industry's evolution since my departure. Jennifer's perspective on my former colleagues was illuminating, particularly her assessment of Robert's professional reputation. Robert was always ethically challenged, Jennifer said. Everyone knew he was cutting corners and treating employees badly, but nobody wanted to be the one to report him. What he did to you when you got sick was just the final confirmation of his character. Did you hear about his recent legal trouble? Oh yes, Jennifer said with obvious satisfaction. Sexual harassment, embezzlement, fraud charges. Couldn't have happened to a more deserving person. I heard the evidence against him was incredibly thorough, like someone had been documenting his crimes for months. I chose not to comment on the source of that evidence, but Jennifer's reaction reinforced my growing sense that my campaign might be viewed more favorably than I'd anticipated by people who'd witnessed my target's behavior firsthand. Inez, Jennifer said as our conversation wound down, I want you to know that your work made a real difference in a lot of people's lives. You saved careers, improved products, and protected patients even when it cost you personally. Whatever you're doing with your remaining time, I hope you know that your professional legacy is secure. After hanging up with Jennifer, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my diagnosis, a sense of peace about my approaching death. For weeks I'd been focused entirely on revenge and destruction, using my campaign as a way to avoid processing my own mortality. But Jennifer's words reminded me that my life had included positive contributions alongside the vindictive one. Saturday brought my most challenging visitor yet, Sophie, who arrived looking haggard and desperate, but also determined in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of my younger self. Mom, she said, standing in my doorway with tears streaming down her face, I need to talk to you before you die. Please, I let her in, though every instinct told me that this conversation would be different from my encounters with Patricia and Margaret. Sophie had spent days processing my revelation about the sabotage campaign, and her emotional state suggested she'd reached some kind of resolution that might complicate my narrative. I've been thinking about what you told me, Sophie said, settling onto my couch with the careful movements of someone who'd been sleeping badly and eating little. About the campaign you've been running against me and Dad and the others. It wasn't a campaign, I corrected. It was just. Sophie nodded slowly. I understand why you see it that way, and I understand why you hate me for choosing Dad's side during the divorce. I made a terrible mistake that hurt you deeply, and I've regretted it every day since then. Regret doesn't undo damage. You spent 3 years treating me like I was dead. Now you can spend the rest of your life knowing that I actually died hating you. Maybe, Sophie said quietly, but before that happens I need you to understand something that I've learned about myself over the past week. Sophie pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages she'd exchanged with Derek over the previous few days. The conversations revealed a side of my ex-husband that I'd never seen: panicked, desperate, and viciously angry at his inability to control his circumstance. Dad has been calling me constantly since his lawyer told him about the federal investigation, Sophie explained. He's convinced that you're responsible for everything that's happened to him and he wants me to help him prove it. The messages showed Derek becoming increasingly unhinged as he demanded that Sophie provide testimony about my supposed mental instability and vengeful nature. When Sophie had refused to cooperate, Derek had exploded into a series of abusive texts that revealed the same controlling personality I'd endured throughout our marriage. This is who Dad really is, Sophie said, scrolling through messages where Derek called her ungrateful and threatened to cut off her trust fund payments if she didn't support his legal defense. This is the man I chose over you, and I'm just now understanding what that choice really meant. I read through Derek's messages with growing satisfaction. Even under extreme stress, he couldn't resist displaying the same abusive tendencies that had defined our marriage. Sophie was finally seeing her father's true character, but the revelation had come too late to change the fundamental dynamics between us. "You're realizing that Derek is exactly the man I always told you he was," I said. "But that doesn't change the fact that you believed his lies about me for 3 years." "You're right," Sophie said simply. "I believed him because it was easier than confronting the truth about our family. Dad offered financial security and simple explanations, while you represented uncertainty and emotional complexity." Sophie's honesty was more disarming than her previous apologies had been. She wasn't making excuses or trying to minimize her role in our estrangement. Instead, she was acknowledging the calculated nature of her choice and the selfishness that had motivated it. "I chose Dad because he offered me what I wanted," Sophie continued. "Financial stability, social status, and the comfort of not having to think too deeply about family dynamics. I knew you were probably telling the truth about his behavior, but I didn't want to deal with that reality, so you decided I was mentally ill instead." "I decided you were inconvenient," Sophie said, her voice breaking slightly. "I chose the version of events that allowed me to keep the life I wanted without feeling guilty about it. And when you got sick, I felt terrible about our estrangement, but still couldn't bring myself to admit that I'd been wrong." Sophie's analysis of her own motivations was brutally accurate and surprisingly mature. She'd moved beyond simple apologies to genuine self-reflection, acknowledging not just her mistakes, but the character flaws that had enabled them. "The financial chaos you created forced me to confront who I really am," Sophie said. "When my security disappeared, I had to examine the choices I'd made and the person I'd become, and what I discovered was that I'd inherited more of Dad's character than I wanted to admit." "What do you mean?" Sophie pulled up her social media profiles on her phone, showing me posts from before her financial troubles began. The images revealed a lifestyle built entirely around material consumption and social status, with expensive restaurants, designer purchases, and luxury experiences that were funded by Derek's trust fund payments. "I became exactly what Dad raised me to be," Sophie said. "Someone who values money and status over relationships and integrity. I treated you as disposable because you represented financial uncertainty, the same way Dad treated his employees as disposable when they became liabilities." The parallel was accurate and devastating. Sophie had indeed internalized Derek's values, prioritizing financial security over emotional authenticity in ways that mirrored his corporate behavior. "Your campaign against me wasn't just punishment," Sophie continued. "It was education. You forced me to experience powerlessness so I could understand what I'd done to you. You made me confront the reality of my own character by stripping away the financial cushions that had hidden it." Sophie's interpretation of my motives was more generous than I'd intended, but it wasn't entirely wrong. Part of my satisfaction in destroying her financial stability had come from forcing her to confront truths about herself that she'd been avoiding. "Does understanding my motives change how you feel about what I did to you?" I asked. Sophie considered the question carefully. "It makes me angry that you chose destruction over communication."
You could have explained these things to me without ruining my credit and getting me evicted. You could have given me a chance to grow and change without creating trauma that I'll carry for the rest of my life. Would you have listened if I'd simply called and asked for a conversation? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Probably not. I was too comfortable with the status quo to examine it voluntarily. You had to force the confrontation by making my current situation unbearable. So you understand why I chose the methods I did. I understand them, but I can't forgive them," Sophie said. "What you did was effective but cruel. You prioritized your desire for revenge over any possibility of repairing our relationship." Sophie's assessment was fair but incomplete. I hadn't prioritized revenge over repair. I'd concluded that repair was impossible given the fundamental differences in our values and priorities. Sophie had spent 3 years demonstrating that our relationship meant less to her than Derek's financial support. No amount of conversation could undo that reality. "Sophie," I said carefully, "even if you'd been willing to listen and change, our relationship was broken beyond repair. You chose Derek's money over loyalty to your mother. That choice revealed something about your character that couldn't be fixed with apologies and good intentions." "Maybe," Sophie said. But you'll never know for certain because you chose destruction over the possibility of redemption. You decided that revenge was more satisfying than forgiveness. Sophie's words carried an accusation that I couldn't entirely dismiss. Had I chosen revenge because it was more satisfying than the difficult work of rebuilding our relationship? Had my campaign been motivated by genuine justice or simply by the desire to inflict pain on people who'd hurt me? The questions were uncomfortable because they contained elements of truth. Part of my satisfaction in destroying my targets had come from pure vindictiveness rather than principled justice. I'd enjoyed their suffering in ways that went beyond reasonable consequences for their action. You're suggesting that I'm as morally compromised as the people I've been punishing, I said. I'm suggesting that you've become someone who prioritizes power over love, Sophie replied. You've used your intelligence and determination to destroy rather than create, to punish rather than heal. Sophie's criticism stung because it contained uncomfortable parallels to the accusations I'd made against my targets. Derek had used his financial power to control and diminish others. Robert had used his professional authority to exploit and discard vulnerable people. Linda had used her perceived moral superiority to judge and dismiss those who struggled. And I had used my technical skills and intimate knowledge of their weaknesses to systematically destroy their lives in ways they couldn't defend against or escape from. The difference, I said, is that my targets chose to hurt innocent people while I only punished those who'd wronged me. The difference, Sophie countered, is that they hurt people through selfishness and indifference, while you hurt people through deliberate malice. Your actions were more calculated and therefore more morally problematic. The debate continued for another hour, with Sophie challenging every aspect of my justification for the campaign, while acknowledging the legitimate grievances that had motivated it. Her analysis was sophisticated and uncomfortable, forcing me to confront aspects of my behavior that I'd been avoiding. By the time Sophie left, I was emotionally exhausted but oddly grateful for the conversation. She'd provided a perspective on my actions that was more nuanced than the simple victim and villain narrative I'd been telling myself. But Sophie's challenges to my moral framework didn't change the fundamental satisfaction I felt about my campaign. Regardless of the ethical complexities, I'd succeeded in making my targets understand what it felt like to be powerless and abandoned. They'd learned lessons about consequences that they wouldn't forget. Sunday brought my final unexpected visitor, Linda, who arrived looking sober for the first time in weeks, but obviously struggling to maintain her composure. "Inez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got your letter. I know what you've done to me, and I need to understand why." Linda's appearance shocked me. She'd lost significant weight, her hair was unwashed and poorly maintained, and her clothes suggested someone who'd stopped caring about her appearance. The confident, superior woman who'd lectured me about personal responsibility had been replaced by someone who looked broken and lost. "I told you why in the letter," I said. "You dismissed my struggles and judged my failures while offering no support during the worst period of my life." Linda nodded slowly. "I remember those conversations. I thought I was giving you tough love, helping you face reality instead of enabling self-pity. You were protecting yourself from having to acknowledge that bad things happen to good people through no fault of their own," I corrected. "My divorce and financial struggles threatened your belief that people get what they deserve." Linda sat heavily in my living room, looking around at the space with the careful attention of someone who was seeing it for the last time. "You're dying," she said finally, "and you've spent your last months destroying the lives of people who hurt you. Don't you want to make peace before you go?" "I've made my peace," I said. "I've ensured that everyone who wronged me understands the consequences of their actions." Linda was quiet for several minutes, processing my response with the deliberate care of someone who'd been forced to think more deeply about life than she'd ever wanted to. "The business failures, the scheduling problems, the negative reviews," she said. "You orchestrated all of it." "I created opportunities for your existing weaknesses to be exposed," I corrected. "Your technological incompetence and poor customer service were already problems. I just made sure they couldn't be hidden anymore." Linda's laugh was bitter and self-aware. "You're right. I was proud of being low-tech, treating it like a charming personality quirk instead of a professional liability. And I did provide poor customer service sometimes, especially when I was stressed or overwhelmed. You also provided poor sister service," I added. "When I needed support after my divorce, you offered judgment. When I needed understanding after my diagnosis, you offered platitudes. I didn't know how to help, Linda said simply. Your problems seemed so big and complicated, and I felt inadequate to deal with them. It was easier to believe that you'd created your own difficulties than to admit that I couldn't fix them. Linda's honesty was more complete than I'd expected. She wasn't just acknowledging her mistakes, she was examining the character flaws that had enabled them. I've lost everything, Linda continued. My business, my house, my reputation, my self-respect. I've been forced to confront every weakness and failure I'd been avoiding. And you know what the worst part is? What? I deserved it, Linda said, tears streaming down her face. Not the specific methods you used, but the general consequences. I was a bad sister, a mediocre businesswoman, and a self-righteous person who judged others to avoid examining myself. Linda's admission was more satisfying than her destruction had been. She'd been forced to confront the same uncomfortable truths about herself that I'd been seeing for years. Does understanding why I punished you make the punishment easier to bear? No, Linda said, but it makes it meaningful instead of random. You gave my suffering a purpose, which is more than life usually offers. Linda's perspective on her punishment was unexpectedly philosophical. She'd found meaning in her destruction that went beyond simple cause and effect. Inez, Linda said, as she prepared to leave, I'm going to rebuild my life, but I'm going to do it differently. Your campaign taught me things about myself that I needed to learn, even though the education was brutal. What will you do different? I'll be more honest about my limitations, more generous with people who are struggling, and less quick to judge situations I don't understand. I'll try to become the sister you needed, instead of the sister you had. Linda's promise of personal growth was touching but ultimately irrelevant. She'd learned valuable lessons about herself and her relationships, but those lessons had come too late to repair the damage between us. After Linda left, I found myself alone with the knowledge that my campaign was truly complete. Every target had been confronted with the consequences of their actions, and most had gained some understanding of the character flaws that had made them vulnerable to my sabotage. But their newfound self-awareness didn't change my approaching death or repair the relationships that had been permanently damaged. I would die knowing that justice had been served, but also knowing that I'd chosen destruction over the possibility of redemption. As Sunday evening approached and my consciousness became increasingly intermittent, I reflected on the unexpected complexity of my final weeks. What had begun as a simple campaign of revenge had evolved into something more nuanced and morally ambiguous. I'd succeeded in making my targets understand powerlessness and abandonment, but they'd also gained insights into themselves that might ultimately make them better people. Derek was finally seeing the abusive patterns that had defined his relationship. Sophie was confronting the selfishness that had guided her choices. Linda was acknowledging the judgmental nature that had characterized her interactions with others. Even Robert from his prison cell would eventually be forced to examine the entitlement and misconduct that had destroyed his career. My campaign had been both destructive and educational, both vindictive and instructive. The people I'd targeted would carry scars from my actions, but they'd also carry knowledge that might prevent them from hurting others in the future. Whether that knowledge justified my methods was a question I couldn't answer definitively. But as my strength faded and death approached, I felt satisfied that my final act had been one of consequence rather than resignation. I'd used my remaining time to ensure that my voice was heard and my impact was felt. Inez Walker would not disappear quietly or be forgotten easily. The people who'd wronged me would remember my name and understand my power for the rest of their lives. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that sometimes precedes death. The pain medication Dr. Martinez had prescribed was barely keeping the agony manageable, but my mind felt sharper than it had in weeks. I knew this would be my last day of coherent thought, possibly my last day alive, and I wanted to spend it reviewing the completeness of my work. The news reports that morning confirmed the scope of my success. Derek's federal investigation had expanded to include money laundering charges, with prosecutors suggesting he'd been part of a sophisticated financial fraud network. The irony was perfect. Derek was being investigated for crimes I'd fabricated, but the investigation was uncovering actual financial irregularities that would have gone unnoticed otherwise. Robert's embezzlement trial had been scheduled for the following month, with prosecutors confident they had enough evidence to secure a conviction that would send him to prison for at least 7 years. Margaret had provided additional testimony about his financial misconduct during their marriage, turning their divorce proceedings into a masterclass in legal destruction. Linda's name had appeared in the local bankruptcy filings, confirming the complete collapse of her business and personal finance. But more satisfying was a small item in the community news section reporting that she'd begun volunteering at a homeless shelter, working with people who'd experienced the same kind of sudden financial catastrophe that had destroyed her own life. Sophie's social media presence had evolved from desperate self-promotion to thoughtful reflection on privilege and family dynamics. Her recent post showed someone grappling seriously with personal growth, though the trauma of our final conversations was evident in her writing about toxic relationships and generational damage. Each of my targets was experiencing exactly the consequences I'd designed for them, but they were also responding in ways that suggested genuine learning and development. The question that haunted my final hours was whether this growth justified the methods I'd used to achieve it. Dr. Martinez called around noon to check on my condition, her voice gentle but professionally concerned. "Inez, your test results from last week show significant organ involvement. You should be in the hospital for pain management and comfort care." I thanked her but declined again. I'd made peace with dying alone in my own space, surrounded by the evidence of my final campaign rather than sterile medical equipment and well-meaning strangers. "Is there anyone you'd like me to contact?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Family members who should know how little time you have left." I considered the question seriously. Derek would probably celebrate my death once he learned about it. Linda might feel guilt and relief in equal measure. Robert wouldn't hear the news until someone told him in prison. Sophie might feel genuine grief mixed with unresolved anger about our final conversations. "There's no one," I said finally. "I've said everything I needed to say to the people who mattered." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Inez, I want you to know that you've been one of the most remarkable patients I've ever treated. Your strength and determination throughout this illness have been extraordinary." Her words touched something deep inside me that I'd thought had died along with my diagnosis. For months I'd defined myself entirely through my campaign of revenge, measuring my worth by my ability to destroy the people who'd wronged me. But Dr. Martinez saw something else: resilience, intelligence, purpose that went beyond vindictiveness. After hanging up with Dr. Martinez, I found myself thinking about the positive aspects of my life that I'd ignored while focusing on revenge. My career had genuinely helped people, developing medications that improved lives and solving marketing challenges that connected patients with treatments they needed. My relationship with Sophie had been meaningful and loving before Derek's manipulation destroyed it. Even my marriage had included moments of real happiness before Derek's true nature revealed itself. I'd spent my final months erasing these positive memories in favor of grievances and retribution, but they remained part of my legacy whether I acknowledged them or not. The afternoon brought one final unexpected visitor, Jennifer Morrison, my former colleague who'd called to check on me the previous week. She arrived with flowers and a bottle of wine, settling into my living room with the easy familiarity of someone who'd shared years of professional challenges and personal conversations. "I wanted to see you one more time," Jennifer said simply, "and to tell you about something that happened at work last week." Jennifer explained that Robert's replacement at the pharmaceutical company had implemented new policies protecting employees who took medical leave, citing recent events that had highlighted the importance of supporting workers during health crises. The changes would prevent future managers from discriminating against sick employees the way Robert had discriminated against me. "Your situation created awareness that led to real policy changes," Jennifer said. "Employees who get sick won't face the same treatment you experience. In a way, what happened to you is protecting other people now." The revelation was unexpected and deeply satisfying. My professional suffering had led to systemic changes that would benefit future employees, giving my experience meaning beyond personal grievance. Jennifer and I spent 2 hours reminiscing about our shared work experiences, discussing industry developments, and analyzing the pharmaceutical company's recent strategic decision. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, intelligent, capable, and valued for qualities that had nothing to do with revenge or destruction. "Inez," Jennifer said as she prepared to leave, "I want you to know that your professional legacy is secure."
The work you did saved lives and improved treatments for thousands of patients. Whatever else has happened recently, that contribution remains meaningful. After Jennifer left, I felt a sense of completion that was different from the satisfaction I'd experienced when my revenge campaign succeeded. This was the peace that comes from being seen and appreciated for your best qualities, rather than your most destructive ones. As evening approached and my physical condition deteriorated further, I made one final decision that surprised me. I called Sophie. She answered immediately, her voice breathless with hope and concern. "Mom, how are you feeling?" "I'm dying," I said matter-of-factly. "Tonight, probably. I wanted to talk to you one more time." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "Do you want me to come over? I can drive down from Seattle right now." "No," I said. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." I explained to Sophie that my campaign against her and the others had been motivated by genuine pain and legitimate grievances, but that my methods had been unnecessarily cruel and destructive. I told her about my conversation with Jennifer and the policy changes that had resulted from my professional experiences. "I spent my final months focusing on punishment rather than healing," I said. "I chose revenge over the possibility of redemption, both for myself and for the people who'd hurt me." Sophie listened without speaking, occasionally making soft sounds that indicated she was crying. "I want you to know that destroying your financial stability wasn't just about punishing you for choosing Derek," I continued. "Part of it was about forcing you to confront the person you'd become, and giving you an opportunity to develop into someone better." "Did it work?" Sophie asked quietly. "I think so. Your recent social media posts show someone grappling seriously with personal growth and family dynamics. You're asking hard questions about yourself that you wouldn't have asked if your life had remained comfortable." Sophie was quiet for several minutes. Then, "Mom, I need you to know that I forgive you for what you did to me. I understand why you felt you had no other choice." Her forgiveness was unexpected and more moving than I'd anticipated. Throughout my campaign, I'd convinced myself that Sophie's opinion didn't matter because she'd already betrayed our relationship. But hearing her forgive me for my cruelty felt like a gift I didn't deserve. "I also need you to know," Sophie continued, "that I'm sorry for choosing Dad over you. I was young and scared and selfish, but those aren't excuses. I made a terrible choice that hurt you deeply, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." "Sophie," I said carefully, "I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase consequence. You'll carry the trauma of what I did to you, just like I carried the trauma of what you did to me, but maybe that knowledge will help you make better choices in your future relationships." "It already has," Sophie said. "I've been seeing the therapist regularly, and I've started volunteering with homeless services. I'm trying to understand what it means to be vulnerable and powerless, so I can develop real empathy, instead of the superficial kind I had before." Sophie's commitment to personal growth was genuine and impressive. My destruction of her financial security had indeed forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself, and she was responding with maturity and self-reflection. "Mom," Sophie said as our conversation neared its end, "I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too weak and selfish to show it properly. I want you to know that as you're dying, I love you too," I said, surprising myself with the truth of. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the campaign I'd waged against her, the fundamental bond between mother and daughter remained intact. We talked for another hour about memories from Sophie's childhood, shared experiences that predated the family conflicts and financial pressures that had divided us. By the time we hung up, I felt something approaching peace about our relationship. As Monday night deepened and my consciousness became increasingly fragmented, I reflected on the complexity of my final months. I'd set out to punish people who'd wronged me, and I'd succeeded beyond my expectation. But I'd also inadvertently created opportunities for growth and learning that might not have existed otherwise. Derek would serve his time and emerge from prison with a deeper understanding of powerlessness and consequence. Linda would rebuild her life with greater humility and empathy for people facing difficulties. Robert would spend years confronting the selfishness and entitlement that had characterized his behavior. Sophie would carry trauma but also wisdom about family dynamics and personal responsibility. My campaign had been both destructive and educational, both vindictive and instructive, The people I'd targeted would be permanently changed by their experiences, hopefully in ways that would prevent them from hurting others in the future. But more importantly, I'd learned something about myself during my final weeks. I'd discovered that I was capable of both tremendous cruelty and unexpected grace, that my intelligence could be used for destruction or creation, that my final act could be defined by revenge or reconciliation. In the end, I'd chosen both. I'd punished those who deserved consequences, while also creating opportunities for redemption and growth. I'd destroyed their sense of security while forcing them to develop resilience and self-awareness. As my vision blurred and my breathing became labored, I felt satisfied that my life had mattered in ways both positive and negative. Inez Walker had made a difference in the world, had left marks that couldn't be erased or ignored. The people who'd wronged me would remember my name and understand my power for the rest of their lives, but they'd also remember the lessons I'd forced them to learn about themselves and their relationships with others. I'd gotten my revenge, but I'd also gotten something more valuable: the knowledge that even in death, I'd contributed to the complicated work of human growth and understanding. My final thought as consciousness faded was that 6 months had been exactly enough time to accomplish everything I'd needed to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.